Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Was Only a Caregiver? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. The city was immersed in twilight, an orange-gray mantle that colored the buildings with a restless shadow. In the streets, the sound of footsteps and cars mixed with an inner silence that few would notice. In a majestic villa, above the hustle and bustle of the world, Enji Todoroki stared at his reflection on the dark glass of the window. His image gave him back something that was not just tiredness. It was a sense of emptiness that grew more and more every day, a weight that not even the title of number one hero could cover. 3 children. 3 fragile souls who needed him, yet he always felt too far away. Tuya, Natsuo, and Shoto were not just children to be raised. They were fragments of a family that had broken up too soon, pieces of a puzzle that no one seemed interested in putting back together. His wife, Rei, had chosen the path of escape after Shoto's birth, divorcing the man and asking for a large sum of money, as she was not interested in that family at all. Enji sighed, walking away from the window. 6 years had passed since that event. His house was silent, too quiet to be true. The children were in their room, perhaps already immersed in their games or, more likely, in their worries, because in that house, even fun always seemed to be filtered by a cloud of tension. He had tried to compensate for the lack of Rei with his presence, with rigor, with DSP, but all he got was the distance of his children. An invisible barrier that not even he could overcome. Always focused on having his children trained to raise them and make them become heroes for future generations, but this unfortunately led to a deeper fracture. And yet, it had to continue. Because he was Enji Todoroki, Japan's number one hero, and the world didn't wait. He didn't care if his children would hate him, if they would see in him only a busy and distant man. Duty came first. All the time. The thought led him to yet another decision of the evening, an announcement. Although she was a very proud person, she needed help, someone who could take care of the children when he was not around. He didn't just want just any adult, he was looking for someone reliable, discreet, who could keep his balance in a house where even a small mistake could trigger a crisis. Placing an ad had been simple. A few lines, concise, neutral. Domestic assistant wanted for 3 children. Flexible hours. Discretion required. Preferable experience. Then he had left it there without thinking too much about it. He did not imagine that this announcement would attract a particular gaze, one that he would never have expected to see cross the threshold of his house. On the other side of the city, Izuku Midoriya looked at his life as one observes a distant and unreachable panorama. 20 years old and already used to loneliness, without family, without quirk, without hope of becoming a hero. Growing up in a world that seemed to reward those with power, those with connections, those with a safe place to call home, he had none of that. Just a small apartment, a bill to pay, and the constant feeling of being invisible. He was an omega. And for Izuku, that word didn't just mean a biological role. It was a social condemnation, a mark of fragility that his family had rejected. Abandoned by those who should have loved him, raised between looks of contempt and heavy silences, he had learned to walk lightly, not to ask, not to hope. Every day was a struggle to pay the rent, to put together food on the table, to survive without becoming a burden to anyone. Still, that ad caught his attention. Not for the prestige of the place, not for the name that accompanied it, but for the possibility of earning, of finally having a secure job. A work that did not judge his status as an omega, that did not ask him to be a hero, only to be present. Izuku's heart pounded faster as he stared at the screen. He could have ignored it as he had always done with opportunities that seemed too big, too risky. But this time it was different. He needed to try, even at the cost of being rejected, even at the cost of showing himself vulnerable. So, he made a decision that would change everything. He would send his application. The days that followed were a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Each time he received a notification, Izuku's breathing became shorter. He didn't know that man, Enji Todoroki. Personally, he only knew that he was Endeavor, the number one hero. NG, on the other hand, had not even bothered to read all the applications. Too many names, too many faces. Too many people who could have disappointed. But when he saw his application, something struck him. It was not an arrogant request, it was not a curriculum full of pretensions. It was simple, honest, humble. And for some reason, among all those letters, NG found himself thinking that maybe, perhaps, this young man could bear the weight of his house. The interview was scheduled for the following morning. NG wasn't used to getting excited about a simple encounter, but that night he found himself staring at the ceiling, thinking about what it would be like to have someone by his side, someone he could understand, without judging, without demanding. When Izuku arrived at the door of the Todoroki mansion, his heart was pounding. It wasn't just nervousness about the interview. It was the realization that he was about to enter a world completely different from his own, a world where he was vulnerable, a world where any mistake would have consequences. Yet, underneath that fear, there was a spark of hope that he hadn't felt in years. NG welcomed him without apparent enthusiasm. The door opened and young Omega entered, hesitantly, his gaze downcast and his hands trembling. NG peered down at him, immediately noticing his cautious posture, his gentle voice, his eyes that tried to read the situation without being noticed. "You're late," NG said neutrally without raising his voice. But there was a weight, an authority that made Izuku feel tiny. Excuse me, sir. I took your ad and I wanted to try to apply," Izuku stammered, trying to look confident, even though he was shaking inside. NG watched him for a few seconds that seemed like eternity. There was something about that boy that intrigued him, something he couldn't define. Maybe it was the silent courage, the dignity in spite of everything, or maybe it was just the fact that he didn't beg. It was not what he expected, and perhaps for this reason it attracted his attention. "All right," NG finally said. "You'll start tomorrow. You need to know the house rules and, above all, the children. It won't be easy." Izuku nodded, almost incredulous. He couldn't believe that he had been hired, that he finally had a chance. But a thought crossed him at once. He wasn't sure what awaited him, or if he would be able to bear it. That night, Izuku returned to his small apartment, sitting on the floor of his room, surrounded by the flickering lights of the street lamps outside. He was breathing hard, his heart still in turmoil. For the first time in a long time, he felt something resembling hope, a small step towards a world where perhaps, finally, someone would see who he really was, and not just what his body or his story had imposed on him. And on the other side of town, NG Todoroki sat at his desk, looking at photos of his children and Izuku's letters still open on the table. She didn't know it yet, but something unexpected was about to enter her life. Something that would have challenged the rules, habits, and perhaps even his heart. Two solitudes, so different and yet so similar, were about to touch each other. And neither of them could ever go back. Izuku woke up before the alarm could go off. For a few seconds he stood motionless on the futon, staring at the slightly yellowed ceiling of his small apartment. The silence was broken only by the distant noise of morning traffic. His heart was already beating faster than normal, a mixture of anxiety and expectation that squeezed his chest. It was not a dream. That day he would really start working in the house of the #1 hero. She sat down slowly, running a hand through her tousled hair. He breathed deeply, as he did whenever he had to face something important. "It's all right. You just have to do your best." He got up, adjusted his futon, and went to wash his face. The cold water helped him clear his head. In front of the mirror he observed his own reflection. 20 years old, gentle features, green eyes always too expressive for an Omega who had learned to survive while remaining invisible. A smile imposed itself, small but sincere. To dress he chose something simple and clean, a cream-colored shirt, without decorations, with the sleeves carefully rolled up. Dark trousers, comfortable but neat, flat shoes, well cleaned. He wanted to look trustworthy. Not too flashy, not too modest. Only suitable. Before leaving, he checked that he had everything: documents, phone, a small notebook where he had written down the times that NG had communicated to him the day before. Then he closed the door behind him, with a gesture that already smacked of interrupted routine. The Todoroki villa stood silent and imposing, surrounded by a garden cared for with almost maniacal precision. Clear walls, clean lines, traditional Japanese architecture that conveyed order and distance at the same time. Izuku stood in front of the gate for a moment, feeling his own omega scent churn just under his skin. She held it at bay, breathing in slowly. He rang. The door opened shortly after. Enji Todoroki was there, ready to go out, hero's uniform, rigid posture, stern gaze. His presence filled the space without the need for words. A dominant alpha, in all respects. You're on time. It was not a compliment, just an observation. Yes, sir. Good morning. Izuku bowed slightly, keeping his gaze down. Enji looked at him for a moment, then turned around. Come in. I'll explain the rules before you go. Izuku followed him inside. The house was even bigger than he imagined. Wide hallways, polished wooden floors, sliding rice paper doors. Everything was tidy, but cold as if it were a half-lived house. Enji stopped in the living room. Listen carefully. I won't repeat twice. Izuku nodded immediately. The kids come back from school at 12. Lunch should be served at 1300 hours precisely. Tuya and Natsuo eat what is there. Shoto needs smaller portions. He paused. Dinner is at 19. I return between 19:30 and 20. The house must be tidy. No unnecessary noise. No guests. Izuku mentally took note of everything. Now the boys. Enji folded his arms. Tuya is 13 years old. It's an alpha. Stubborn, difficult. Don't provoke him. The gaze became harder. Natsuo is 10 years old, beta. It is the most reasonable. But don't underestimate it. Then he lowered his voice slightly. Shoto is 6 years old. It's an omega. He needs calm. Don't force him to talk. If he cries, manage it. That manage it weighed more than any other word. If something serious happens, call me. For the rest, take care of them. He took the keys. You're not here to educate them. You're here to look after them. He walked towards the door. Before leaving, he paused for a moment. Do your job well. And he left, closing the door with a sharp thud. The silence that followed seemed even heavier. Izuku stood still for a few seconds, then slowly let out the breath he was holding. All right, I can do it. He decided to start familiarizing himself with the house. He walked slowly, almost on tiptoe, as if he was afraid of disturbing even the walls. The living room was large, with a few basic pieces of furniture. No family photos in sight. Only order and empty space. The kitchen was modern, spotless. Izuku felt almost relieved. At least here I know what to do. He looked at his watch. He had time. He decided to prepare something simple but nutritious. Japanese curry, a warm and reassuring dish, suitable even for a small child. He put the rice to cook, carefully cut the vegetables, following gestures he knew well. Cooking calmed him down. When everything was ready, he carefully set the table. 3 seats. A smaller one. At 12:35, she heard the front door open. Izuku stiffened. Voices. Steps. The energy changed suddenly. Tuya entered first. Tall for his age, unkempt hair, eyes lit up with a restless light. His gaze immediately fell on Izuku, peering down on him without any shame. Who are you? He asked in an abrupt tone. I'm Izuku Midoriya, he said softly. I'll take care of you from today. Natsuo entered immediately after. More composed, he observed him with curiosity, without hostility but without a smile. Shoto arrived last, clutching the backpack with both hands. His two-tone eyes barely raised to Izuku, then lowered again. Izuku smelled her omega scent, light, fragile. His heart tightened. Dinner is ready, he said softly. You can wash your hands. Tuya snorted, but obeyed. Natsuo followed in silence. Shoto hesitated for a moment, then moved slowly. At the table, no one spoke. Izuku observed without being noticed. Tuya ate. Quickly, as if he wanted to finish as soon as possible. Natsuo tasted carefully. Shoto broke up the food, eating slowly. It's good, murmured Natsuo after a while. Izuku barely smiled. I'm glad. Tuya said nothing. He stared at him only for a moment, then went back to eating. Lunch ended like this, in a silence full of unsaid things. Izuku began to clear the table, aware that this was just the beginning. No bonds, no trust. Just a big house, 3 children locked in their own worlds. And him, a foreign Omega, in the middle. And the day had just begun. After lunch, the house slowly returned to a controlled silence, different from that of the morning. It was not empty, it was full of presences, of restrained steps, of thoughts that no one seemed to want to share. Izuku finished washing the dishes with precise movements, drying them one by one before putting them away. Every gesture was measured, almost ritual. He knew he was being watched, even if no one spoke openly. Tuya, leaning against the doorframe, stared at him suspiciously. Natsuo had sat down at the table with an open notebook. Shoto had remained motionless in the chair, his hands clasped on his lap. "After lunch you can do whatever you like," Izuku said in a calm voice. "If you have homework or if you want to play." Tuya snorted. "You're not our father." Izuku was unperturbed. He lowered his head slightly. "I know." That answer seemed to surprise him. Tuya pursed his lips, then turned and walked away without saying anything else, the heavy footsteps echoing in the hallway. Natsuo followed him with his gaze, then looked back at Izuku. "That's the way he is," he said softly, as if to justify it. Izuku nodded. "I see." Shoto hadn't said a word. Izuku lowered himself slightly to match him. "If you want, I can help you with something." The boy barely raised his eyes, then shook his head. A silent refusal, but not hostile. Izuku took it as a small success. He decided not to force it any further. The afternoon slipped away between light cleaning and discreet attempts to understand the children's routine. Izuku tidied up the living room, wiped the surfaces with a cloth, and opened the windows to change the air. Each room seemed to tell something, even without words. Tuya's room was messy, full of torn notebooks and clothes thrown everywhere. A chaotic, angry energy. Izuku didn't touch anything, just observing. Natsuo's room was tidy, almost too tidy for a child of his age. Carefully stacked books, a clean desk. Shoto's room was the quietest, a few toys, arranged in a row, as if someone was afraid of creating a mess. Izuku walked out slowly, closing the door. In the late afternoon he found Natsuo in the living room, intent on doing his homework. He slowly approached. "If you want, I can help you." Natsuo looked at him for a few seconds, then nodded. "Mathematics." They sat next to each other, not too close. Izuku explained calmly, using simple examples. Natsuo listened attentively, occasionally nodding. "Will you stay here?" he asked at one point, pretending to concentrate on the notebook. Izuku hesitated for a moment. "Yes. That's my job." "So?" Natsuo shrugged. "Okay." It wasn't an actual acceptance, but it was something. Shoto watched them from afar, sitting on the tatami. Izuku felt his gaze on him like a thin thread. Every now and then the child looked away, as if he feared being discovered. Tuya didn't show up for hours. As the sun began to set, Izuku got up. "It's almost dinner time. You can wash your hands." This time no one protested. In the kitchen, Izuku decided to prepare something simple and warm. Nikujiga, a stew of meat and potatoes, soft and fragrant. A dish that tasted like home, even if that house was not his. While cooking, he heard Tuya enter without being announced. The air changed immediately. The alpha scent of the boy was more marked, restless. "Do you cook for him too?" he asked in a sharp tone. Izuku didn't turn around right away. "He'll be back tonight." "He always comes back late," murmured Tuya. Izuku took that sentence for what it really was. Not a criticism, but a bitter observation. "I guess it's not easy." Tuya was silent for a long moment. Then he snapped. "Don't talk like you know anything." Izuku finally turned around, his gaze calm. "You're right. I don't know." That recognition seemed to turn something off. Tuya gritted his teeth, then walked out of the kitchen without saying anything else. Dinner was eaten in an even more tense silence than dinner. Shoto ate slowly. Izuku passed him the plates without touching him, respecting his space. Natsuo thanked him in a low voice. Tuya finished quickly and got up before the others. At 7:30 p.m., the front door opened. Enji Todoroki re-entered. His presence was immediately imposed. The children stiffened almost in unison. Izuku stood up and bowed slightly. "Welcome back, sir. Dinner is ready." Enji nodded. "Good." He sat down at the table. They all ate together but no one spoke. Enji observed, recorded every detail, Shoto eating everything, Natsuo not asking questions, Tuya avoiding his gaze. When they finished, Izuku began clearing the table. I'm done for today. I'll be back tomorrow morning." "Yes," said Enji. "You can go." Izuku greeted the children with a small bow. "Good evening." Shoto looked at him. For a moment he seemed to mean something, then he looked down again. Izuku walked out, closing the door behind him. Left alone, Enji took off his gloves and folded his arms. "So." Silence. "How did it go?" he asked, looking at his children one by one. Tuya snorted. "It's just an omega." Natsuo pursed his lips. "Cook well." Shoto did not answer. Enji turned to him. "Shoto." The child hesitated, then said softly, "Don't worry." Nothing else. Enji remained silent. Few comments. No enthusiasm. Yet something remained on him. A shadow of change, subtle, almost imperceptible. On the other side of town, Izuku returned to his small apartment, tired but strangely lucid. He sat down on the futon, bringing his knees to his chest. It had not been a disaster. It had not been a success. But it was a start. And this, for now, had to be enough. Izuku woke up with a different sensation in his chest. It was no longer the pure terror of the first day, nor the paralyzing anxiety of those who fear they will miss every step. It was something more subtle, more difficult to define. A slight tension, as if his body already knew that this house, the Todoroki villa, was starting to occupy a space it shouldn't. He sat down on the futon, rubbing his eyes. For a moment, my thoughts returned to Shoto. The way he had eaten in silence. To its omega scent so light that it almost seems broken. To the unnatural calm of a 6-year-old boy who had already learned not to ask for anything. Don't force it, he told himself as he got up. Let him decide. He chose clothes similar to the day before, a light, clean shirt and dark trousers. He arranged his hair more carefully than necessary, as if the external order could compensate for the uncertainty he felt inside. Before leaving, he paused for a moment in front of the door, his hand on the handle. "It's just a job," he tried to convince himself. The Todoroki villa welcomed him with its usual composed silence. Izuku walked in, taking off his shoes, aligning them precisely. The air was fresh, still. Enji had already gone out. He sensed it from the absence of that alpha scent so dominant that it almost seemed part of the walls. He put on his apron and advanced with light steps, more confident than the day before. It was then that he saw him. Shoto was sitting on the tatami mat in the living room, his knees gathered to his chest, his gaze fixed in front of him. He wasn't playing. He wasn't reading. It seemed. Izuku instinctively slowed down. "Good morning, Shoto," he said softly, keeping his distance. The child did not answer immediately. His fingers tightened slightly in the fabric of his trousers. Then, without looking up, he nodded his head a little. It wasn't a real greeting, but it was something. Izuku sat on the tatami a few steps from him. He didn't speak. He let silence spread between them, calm, non-threatening. After a few seconds, Shoto slowly reached out a toya, small toy car, and slid it across the floor, stopping it halfway between them. Izuku felt his heart tighten. He didn't take it right away. He looked at him, then looked up at Shoto. "Can I?" Shoto nodded slightly. Izuku took the toy car and rolled it slowly, quietly. No word. No laughter. Just a shared gesture. For Shoto, that was enough. From the hallway, Tuya watched them with his arms crossed. His gaze was dark, annoyed. Natsuo, a little further on, had noticed everything without saying anything. Time slipped slowly until it was time to prepare lunch. Izuku calmly stood up. "I'm going to the kitchen. If you want, you can come." It was not a direct invitation. It was an opening. Shoto hesitated, then he too stood up. He followed him at a distance, his steps small and silent. In the kitchen, Izuku began to prepare something simple: tamago don, hot rice with egg and soy sauce, easy to eat and reassuring. Shoto sat down on the tatami, his hands resting on his knees. He watched every movement carefully. "That's laughter," Izuku explained quietly. "And the egg makes it soft." "Hot," murmured Shoto. Izuku smiled. Hot." It was the first word that Shoto addressed to him spontaneously. Izuku did not comment, he did not compliment. He continued to cook as if it were the most natural thing in the world. When lunch was ready, Natsuo and Tuya arrived without enthusiasm. They ate in silence. But Izuku noticed one thing: Shoto was eating faster than the day before. Almost everything ended. Natsuo noticed it too, giving Izuku a brief but significant look. Tuya, on the other hand, clutched his fork tightly, his gaze fixed on the plate. After lunch, the afternoon unfolded quietly but tensely. Natsuo did his homework at the table, Izuku helping him when needed. Tuya locked himself in his room, the door closed with a sharp blow. Shoto remained in the living room, always in the same space as Izuku. He didn't speak, but he didn't leave. Every once in a while, Izuku would feel his omega scent become slightly more present. It wasn't panic, it wasn't pain. It was a need. A silent, instinctive need. Izuku sat down on the tatami mat to fold some clean clothes. Shoto slowly approached. He sat down next to him, close enough for their sleeves to touch. Izuku stiffened for a moment, then relaxed, continuing to bend with slow gestures. Shoto rested his head against his arm. The contact was minimal. Still, Izuku held his breath. Everything is fine, he told himself. You're not forcing it. He is the one who chooses. From the hallway, Tuya saw the scene. His face stiffened. Without saying anything, he turned and disappeared into his room. The sun was starting to go down when Izuku realized one thing, simple and scary at the same time: Shoto wasn't just accepting it. He was looking for him. Not with words, not with requests, but with presence. With the body. With that silence that was no longer frightening. Izuku looked down at the sleeping child against him and felt a twinge in his chest. He couldn't afford to get attached. He shouldn't have. But it was already too late to pretend that that bond was not being born. Shoto woke up slowly. Not suddenly, not frightened. It was like emerging from a warm, safe place, where the body did not need to be on alert. His eyelids trembled slightly, and for a moment he stood motionless, confused. Then he realized where he was. He was still leaning on Izuku's arm. The child did not move immediately. His fingers tightened softly in the fabric of his shirt, as if he feared that a wrong gesture would be enough to make everything disappear. Izuku's scent was subtle, controlled, but for such a small omega it was enough. Stable. Present. Izuku noticed the movement and looked down cautiously. You woke up. Shoto nodded slightly. He did not move away. Izuku said no more. He stood still, letting Shoto decide when to break away. After a few seconds, the boy straightened up, sitting composed, as if he suddenly remembered that he had to be good. Excuse me, he murmured. Izuku felt something squeeze his chest. There's nothing to apologize for. Shoto looked at him for a longer moment than usual. Then he nodded again and moved a few steps, but he didn't leave the room. The afternoon continued in a fragile stillness. Izuku helped Natsuo finish his homework. The boy was concentrated, but every now and then he glanced quickly at Shoto, as if to make sure he was still there, still calm. When he closed the notebook, he sighed softly. Usually. It began, then stopped. Usually, repeated Izuku, without insisting. Natsuo pursed his lips. Shoto struggles in the afternoon. Izuku nodded slowly. He asked for nothing else. There was no need. Tuya didn't leave his room for hours. But Izuku could feel him moving back and forth, like a restless flame. Every now and then, the door opened with it, just long enough to glance at the living room. Every time he saw Shoto near Izuku, the door closed more forcefully. Late in the afternoon, Izuku noticed that something was changing. Shoto was quieter than usual. He moved little. Her omega scent, previously almost imperceptible, began to become more present. It wasn't panic, it wasn't real heat. It was a silent request for stability. Izuku sat on the tatami mat with a picture book. Do you want us to read? Shoto nodded immediately. He sat closer than before. The shoulders almost in contact. Izuku opened the book and began to read in a low, regular voice. Every word was a foothold. Shoto followed the images carefully, breathing slowly. Halfway through the story, the child moved again. This time, without hesitation. He leaned against Izuku's side, his head against his arm. Izuku paused for a moment. Then he continued reading. From the corridor, Natsuo watched in silence. He said nothing. He did not intervene. It was the first time in a long time that he had seen Shoto so quiet in the afternoon. Tuya, on the other hand, reacted differently. Tisk. The noise came sharply. Tuya stood in the doorway, his arms outstretched at his sides. His alpha scent was more pronounced, agitated. You're spoiling him, he said. Izuku looked up, not moving. I'm just reading. You're not of the family. The sentence fell heavy. Shoto stiffened. His fingers tightened in the fabric of Izuku's shirt. Izuku closed the book slowly. You're right. I'm not. Tuya looked taken aback. He expected a defense, a justification. Not the calm one. Then don't pretend to be. He turned and left, his steps hard, uneven. Shoto trembled slightly. Izuku placed a hand on the tatami, next to him, without touching it directly. It's all right. The child nodded, but did not detach. When the front door opened, the sun was already low. The scent of Enji Todoroki spread through the house as a silent command. Alpha dominant, tired, pent-up tension load. The children stiffened almost in unison. Enji entered the living room and stopped. The scene before him was simple, yet it hit him like a punch in the stomach. Shoto was sitting next to Izuku, leaning by his side, asleep. The book was open on Izuku's lap. A hand of the young Omega was resting on the floor, close to the child, like a respected boundary. No one spoke. Izuku looked up slowly. Welcome back, sir. Enji did not answer immediately. Shoto observed. Regular breathing. The absence of tension. It was a calm that Enji hadn't seen in a long time, especially at that time of day. Leave him, he said at last in a low voice. Izuku nodded. He waited for Shoto to wake up on his own. When this happened, the boy opened his eyes and stiffened as soon as he saw Enji. Then, instinctively, he moved closer to Izuku. A small gesture. Instinctive. Enji saw him. And he felt it. He said nothing. Dinner was quieter than usual. Shoto ate without hesitation. Natsuo talked a little about school. Tuya remained silent, his gaze fixed on the plate. Enji observed everything, recording every detail. When they finished, Izuku stood up. I'm done for today. He bowed slightly to Enji and then to the children. Good evening. Shoto looked at him. Tomorrow? Izuku smiled softly. Tomorrow. He left the house with a heavy heart. That night, Enji stayed up longer than usual. Sitting in the empty living room, he stared at the spot where Shoto had fallen asleep. A thought came back to him, insistent, annoying. An Omega shouldn't be that necessary. And yet it had been. And this put him in front of a truth that he could no longer ignore. Izuku arrived at the Todoroki mansion a few minutes earlier than usual. It had become a habit. Arriving earlier meant having time to breathe, to settle down, to slowly enter that house that was not his but that, day after day, was leaving him with a strange sense of belonging. He wore simple clothes, a light-necked, loose, turtleneck sweater and dark pants. Nothing tight, nothing flashy. The Omegas soon learned not to attract unnecessary attention. As soon as he walked through the door, he immediately sensed Enji's presence. The alpha scent was there, more intense than usual. Enji had not yet left. Midoriya. The voice came from the living room, low and firm. Izuku stiffened stiffly. Yes, sir. Enji was standing, his arms folded. His gaze was attentive, analytical. Not hostile, but not neutral either. I noticed that Shoto. It began, then stopped. He seemed to be looking for words, which is rare for him. It's quieter in the afternoon. Izuku looked down instinctively. I'm just trying to keep up with the routine. Silence. Enji was watching him. Not how you look at an employee, but how do you observe something that you can't completely classify? I don't want them to be created. Useless dependencies, he said at last. Izuku felt his stomach contract. I see. Shoto is an omega, Enji continued. He is sensitive. It must not bind itself too easily. Those words struck more than Izuku wanted to admit. I'll be careful, he replied softly. Enji nodded, satisfied. You can get started. He left the house a few minutes later, leaving behind a tension that Izuku took a few moments to dissolve. When the children returned from school, the house was already tidy. Lunch was ready. The smell of hot rice filled the kitchen. Izuku moved with silent, measured gestures. Shoto entered last. He stopped in the doorway. He said nothing. Izuku noticed it right away. He turned slightly without calling him. He didn't want to attract unnecessary attention. Shoto advanced slowly and sat down in his seat. Small hands clasped on his lap. Its omega scent was subdued, but Izuku sensed it anyway. A thread of tension, as if something inside him was asking for confirmation. During lunch, Shoto ate little. Natsuo noticed it. Don't you like it? Shoto shook his head. I like it. But he did not continue. Tuya snorted. Always the same scene. Izuku intervened naturally. If you want, you can finish later. Shoto looked up at him. The heterochrome eyes barely lit up. An imperceptible relaxation of the shoulders. All right. It was a tiny detail. But it was enough. Tuya sees him. He said nothing, but his alpha scent grew sour for an instant. The afternoon passed slowly. Izuku cleaned, arranged, checked the homework. He tried to talk to Tuya, but the boy answered in monosyllables, avoiding the gaze. With Natsuo he managed to exchange a few more words, especially about school. Shoto, on the other hand, always remained at close range. He didn't touch him. He didn't call him. He didn't ask for XPLCT attention. But it was always there. Sitting in the same room. The eyes that followed him. The body that oriented itself towards him without realizing it. Izuku pretended nothing had happened. It was the only way not to cross that invisible line that Enji had spoken of. When Shoto got too close, Izuku shifted slightly. When he accidentally leaned on his side, Izuku held his breath and remained motionless, not returning the contact. Shoto did not protest. But his scent changed. Don't panic. Not discomfort. Disappointment. Enji returned home earlier than usual that evening. As soon as he entered, he immediately perceived something. The house was quiet, but not tense. It was a strange, fragile stillness. He saw Shoto sitting at the table with Natsuo. Tuya was leaning against the wall, his arms crossed. Izuku was serving dinner. Enji watched the scene carefully. Shoto was not near Izuku, but he didn't look at him openly. Yet, his every movement was calibrated to the presence of the other omega. Enji strints la misella. During dinner, he talked more than usual. School churches. Of activities. He tried to involve Shoto directly. Did you do anything interesting today? Shoto hesitated. Then he answered, I have read. What? Shoto looked down. A book. Silence. Enji nodded, dissatisfied. Good. Izuku did not intervene. After dinner, as Izuku prepared to leave, Enji stopped him at the entrance. Midoriya. Izuku turned around. Yes, sir. Keep doing your job. Pause. But remember your role. Izuku bowed his head. I don't forget it. When he left, Shoto stared at the door for long seconds. Later, Enji tried to talk to his children. The new caregiver began. Natsuo shrugged. He's kind. Tuya snorted. It's an omega. Shoto said nothing. Enji looked at him. Shoto. The child hesitated. Then he spoke softly. It doesn't hurt. Those words, simple and incomplete, struck Enji more than any accusation. Because he understood one thing. The link was not yet visible. It was not declared. It wasn't dangerous. But he was growing. And this time, he didn't know whether to break it, or if it was already coming too late. The morning at the Villa Todoroki began like many others. The sky was clear, too clear, and the light came in through the sliding windows illuminating the light wood of the floor. Izuku arrived on time, with the light step of someone who tries not to disturb. He had learned to move in that house like a shadow, present, but never intrusive. He was wearing a light-colored shirt and a soft cardigan, his sleeves slightly rolled up. The colors were neutral, reassuring. Instinctive choices, as an Omega accustomed to calming the environment before even entering it. He put down his shoes at the entrance and bowed slightly as always, even though no one was looking at him. The house was quiet, a silence different from that of the evening. Not loaded, not tense. It was a silence that preceded the movement. Izuku started in the kitchen. He put on the rice, made tea, set up the breakfast table. Every gesture was automatic, but the mind was alert. He had learned that, in that house, the balance could be broken for much less. He heard light footsteps. Shoto appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, still in his pajamas. His two-tone hair was unkempt from sleep, his eyes sleepy. Izuku didn't say anything right away. He just smiled softly. Shoto took a few steps. "Good morning." The voice was low, hesitant. "Good morning, Shoto." Izuku spoke in the same tone, without emphasis. "Did you sleep well?" The boy nodded, but did not answer immediately. He sat down at the table, composed, his hands on his knees. She watched Izuku move, as if he was memorizing every gesture. Shoto's Omega scent was quiet that morning. Still fragile, but stable. Natsuo arrived shortly after, dragging his backpack. He greeted Izuku with a more relaxed nod than usual. "Tuya is awake already," he said. "He came out early, but he'll be back soon." Izuku nodded. "Thank you for telling me." He asked for nothing else. Tuya was often like that, unpredictable, incendiary. Breakfast passed in an almost serene silence. Shoto ate without difficulty. Natsuo spoke briefly about a task. Izuku listened, intervening only when necessary. It was easy to forget, in moments like that, who Enji Todoroki was. As if that house could only be a house. The sound of the door opening interrupted that fragile balance. The air changed immediately. Enji entered with firm steps, already dressed for training. His alpha presence filled the space without the need for words. Izuku instinctively felt his back stiffen, but he kept his expression neutral. "Eat quickly," said Enji. "Training starts earlier today." Shoto looked down. Natsuo nodded without commenting. Izuku simply replied, "Yes, sir." Enji gave him a quick look. Not hostile. Evaluative. "You stay at home," he added. "Fix what needs to be done." "Of course." Enji said no more. The children finished eating in silence and got up. Shoto hesitated for a moment, then looked at Izuku. "I'll be back later." Izuku smiled softly. "I'll wait for you." It was not a promise. Just an observation. When the door closed behind them, the house became silent again. Izuku stood still for a few seconds, as if he were listening to something invisible. Then he began to tidy up. He cleaned the kitchen, swept the corridor, arranged the rooms. Every now and then, he stopped, seized by a sense of uneasiness that he could not explain. He knew that Enji trained his children. Everyone knew it. But knowing and seeing were two different things. While he was arranging the laundry room, he heard a distant noise. A sharp blow. Then another. Izuku stopped. They were not normal noises. Not like the ones he had heard other times. A command. An answer. An impact. His heart beat faster. They will be. Really training that close? He shouldn't have snooped. He knew it. Enji had been clear from the beginning. His role had clear boundaries. And yet, another blow. Stronger. Izuku slowly put down the cloth in his hand. "Just to see if everything is okay." That's what he said. A fragile justification, but sufficient. He approached the corridor that led to the outdoor training area. He didn't come out right away. It remained in the shadows, near the sliding door. Enji's voice came through clearly. Again. There was something about that tone that made Izuku's stomach tighten. It wasn't just authority. It was pressure. An explosion of heat. A muffled scream. Izuku held his breath. He didn't go out. He didn't look yet. But he understood that that quiet morning was ending. And that, without wanting to, he was about to cross a line that Enji Todoroki would not have tolerated. Izuku shouldn't have looked. He knew at the moment he slid the door a few centimeters. Not enough to be seen right away. Quite to see. The training yard was bathed in morning light. The ground was marked, burned in places. The air vibrated with residual heat. Tuya was in the center. He was breathing hard, sweat running down his forehead. The flames around his hands flickered, unstable, more violent than his body seemed able to support. His teeth were clenched, his gaze lit up with anger and frustration. More concentrated. Enji's voice was a sharp blow. Don't waste energy. Tuya growled something incomprehensible and relaunched the attack. The flames exploded, too wide, too violent. The ground split under the impact. Enough. Enji took a step forward. So you burn yourself. Tuya staggered. The flames were suddenly extinguished. The boy leaned forward slightly, his hands on his knees. Izuku felt his stomach turn. Then he saw Shoto. He was further back, too small for that field. His hands outstretched in front of him, a blanket of ice that formed slowly, irregularly. His face was pale, his lips tightened. Don't stop, Enji ordered. Again. Shoto trembled. The ice cracked. Dad. His voice was faint. It hurts. Izuku felt his heart jump into his throat. Enji didn't raise his voice. He didn't need it. Go on. Shoto obeyed. The ice reformed, more often, but the child lost his balance and fell to his knees. A dry, muffled sound. Its omega scent changed instantly. Fear, pain, restrained effort. Izuku stepped forward without realizing it. Stop. The word slipped from his lips before he could stop it. The silence that followed was absolute. Enji turned slowly. The alpha gaze rested on Izuku like physical pressure. Tuya jerked his head up. Natsuo, who had remained on the sidelines, stiffened. Shoto looked up. He saw Izuku. The relief that crossed his face was immediate and devastating. Go back inside, said Enji. Izuku swallowed. I'm sorry Come back. Inside. The tone was lower. More dangerous. Izuku obeyed. He closed the door with shaking hands. Lunch was silent. Too much. The children arrived one after the other. Tuya with heavy, angry steps. Natsuo tense, wary. Shoto walked slowly, as if every movement cost him effort. Izuku welcomed them as always. Calmly. With kindness. As if he had seen nothing. Shoto sat down and placed his hands on the table. His knuckles were red. Izuku noticed everything. If you want to rest a little before eating, he began slowly. Shoto shook his head. No. They ate little. Tuya pushed the plate halfway through. I'm not hungry. Tuya, said Izuku without reproach. The boy looked up, his eyes lit. Don't look at me like that. Izuku lowered his eyes. Sorry. Shoto ate slowly, each bite as a task. His omega scent was still unstable, but he tried to control it. Izuku felt helpless. In the afternoon, Enji returned home earlier than usual. Tension entered with him. Izuku heard it before he even saw it. The alpha scent was tense, irritated. Not explosive. The kind of anger that builds up and becomes more dangerous. Enji stopped in the hallway. Midoriya. Izuku turned around right away. Yes, sir. Come. It was not a request. He followed him into the study. The door closed behind them with a dull noise. Enji turned slowly. You saw the training. Izuku didn't answer right away. Then he nodded. Yes. You weren't authorized. I know. Izuku clasped his hands in front of him. I didn't want to. I don't care what you wanted. Enji's voice changed. It was no longer just authority. It was command. Alpha. Your role in this house is clear, he continued. You are here to look after my children, not to judge how I prepare them. Izuku felt the weight of the voice fall on him like physical pressure. The shoulders stiffened, the Omega instinct screaming to lower one's head, to submit. "I understand," he said, but his voice trembled slightly. Enji took a step forward. "No. Another step. I don't think you understood." Izuku looked up. "It was a mistake. You're not part of this family," Enji said, the voice filling the space. "You're not a hero. You're not an alpha. You're nothing more than a caregiver." Every word was calibrated to strike. "You are not allowed to meddle. You are not allowed to comment. You are not allowed to question my decisions." Izuku felt his heart pounding in his ears. "You spoke out of place," Enji concluded. "And it won't happen again." The alpha voice exploded in the last sentence. "Is that clear?" Izuku's body reacted before his mind. He looked down. The shoulders barely gave way. The Omega instinct bent under the command. "Yes," he whispered. "That's clear." The silence that followed was tense, absolute. Enji stared at him for a few more seconds, then turned around. "You can go back to your job." Izuku left the studio short of breath. He did not cry. The day continued. He cleaned. He fixed it. He prepared dinner. As if nothing had happened. But the house was no longer the same. Shoto looked for him, but Izuku avoided any prolonged contact. Whenever the child got too close, Izuku would move with an excuse. Tuya watched him in silence, her eyes narrowed. Natsuo understood. Dinner was quick. Enji arrived, spoke little. His presence was a wall. When Izuku finished serving, he bowed slightly. "I'm done for today." Enji nodded without looking at him. Izuku turned to the children. "Good evening." Natsuo changed his plan. Tuya said nothing. Shoto hesitated. Then he whispered, "See you tomorrow?" Izuku felt something break. He lowered himself slightly, enough not to be heard by Enji. "Goodbye." He didn't say, "See you tomorrow." He went out. The door closed behind him with a soft sound. Too light for what he had left inside. Shoto stared at the entrance, the Omega scent trembling in the air. Enji noticed it. And for the first time, he wondered if that line he had drawn had not just begun to destroy something he did not know how to rebuild. Shoto woke up with a lump in his stomach. The memory of the previous day was still vivid, the dry noise of Enji's commands, the pressure of his father's alpha voice, and most importantly, the sense of helplessness as Tuya was pushed beyond the limits. And he had been there, forced to obey, trembling, to maintain control while his body screamed in pain. He sat down on the futon, his hands clasped on his lap, breathing slowly. The morning light filtered through the curtains, soft and deceptive. For a moment he wished he could disappear, make himself invisible, not be observed. But he couldn't. The first step of the day was silent. He washed and dressed without speaking. Every gesture was mechanical, as if the body had decided to move forward while the mind was trapped in the training yard. Natsuo entered the room shortly after. She looked at him for a few seconds. His gaze was curious but not intrusive. "Shoto, is everything okay?" he asked softly. Shoto shook his head slightly without looking at him. There were no words he could say, not immediately. He didn't want to admit fear. He didn't want anyone to see how vulnerable he was. Natsuo sighed. He came closer, leaving space as if silence could soothe the cracks that were beginning to form. Tuya, on the other hand, appeared at the door of the room. The dark eyes were still full of anger and frustration from the previous day's training. He didn't speak, he just passed by, closing the door with a sharp blow. Shoto looked into the void after the door closed. A small shiver ran down his spine. The Omega scent was stronger today, a sign of the accumulated tension. Izuku arrived shortly after, as he does every morning. He tried to move as always, silent, respectful, present without being intrusive. He wore a light shirt and dark pants, trying to be a reassuring presence. Shoto barely looked at him. He said nothing. But when Izuku began to tidy up the room, fold clothes, and arrange books, Shoto moved slightly closer. Not enough to get close to him. Just enough to feel his presence as a staple. Izuku noticed. He made no comments, he did not speak. He continued to move slowly, without haste, as if the rhythm of his body could convey stability. When Shoto sat on the floor near the tatami mat, he began to draw. Flickering, insecure lines, but precise in the smallest details, his way to release tension. Izuku watched without intervening, with an attentive but calm gaze. Tuya walked past the room again and saw Shoto drawing. For a moment, his eyes fell on Izuku. A fragment of recognition, that Omega was taking care of them without saying it, without imposing anything. Then Tuya closed the door with a sharp blow, but with less anger than the day before. Natsuo approached Shoto without speaking. He sat a few steps away, watching his little brother unload the weight of the day before on the pages. The morning passed slowly. The tension was palpable, but invisible to the eyes of those who did not know what to look for. The house, tidy and clean, seemed almost to ignore the emotional signs that accumulated in every room. Shoto moved little. I eat little. The Omega scent was persistent, a constant background that enveloped Izuku without anyone talking about what had happened. When it was time for lunch, Izuku prepared the meal carefully. Tamago don, the same reassuring dish as the day before, warm and soft. Shoto sat to the side, not speaking. Natsuo gave him a brief look as if to say, "Don't worry, it's okay." Tuya stayed in the kitchen for a few minutes, then left without saying goodbye. His alpha scent was taut, but less hostile than yesterday. Izuku served the rice with slow gestures. He made no comments, he did not try to ease the tension. Just a nod to Shoto. The boy barely looked at him, but did not speak. He took the spoon and began to eat slowly. After lunch, Izuku began cleaning the kitchen. The movements were regular, almost meditative. He felt Shoto's gaze on him. He wasn't curious. It was not a question. Just observation. A small anchor point in the emotional chaos of that morning. Shoto sat on the floor next to Izuku, the drawing left aside. He rested his hands on his knees, breathing slowly. Izuku felt the Omega scent become more intense. It was not fear. It was a need. The kind of need that is not expressed with words, only with presence. He did nothing. He said nothing. He just continued cleaning. The afternoon arrived without sensational events. Tuya passed by from time to time, silent, with his gaze downcast. Natsuo stayed close to Shoto, offering a quiet presence. Izuku noticed that little Shoto was watching him from time to time, his eyes looking for confirmation. Not words, just looks. And when Shoto moved a few steps closer, Izuku's heart beat faster. He said nothing. He did not move. He just folded a towel as if everything was normal. But nothing was normal. The little Omega was starting to rely on him, without words, without statements. Only with the body. And that awareness was enough to make Izuku's legs tremble. As the sun began to set, the tension in the house became denser. The children moved slowly, no one spoke. The air was full of unspoken words. Izuku calmly prepared dinner, served the dishes. Shoto ate without a problem, but his Omega scent was charged with a residual sense of alertness, as if he was still waiting for something to change. Natsuo spoke little, and Tuya hardly uttered a word. Izuku felt that the tension would remain for a long time to come, even after he left. At the end of dinner, he got up slowly. He bowed to the children. "I'm done for today." Shoto looked at him. He said nothing. Just a little whisper, "Goodbye." Izuku nodded slightly. "Goodbye." He turned to the door, but before leaving he cast one last glance at the house, at the silent children, at the emptiness left by unresolved tensions, at the echo of the alpha voice of the day before. When the door closed behind him, the weight of the day hung in the air. Shoto stared at the entrance. The little Omega trembled inside, still shaken, unable to speak. Natsuo watched him in silence, understanding without words. Tuya turned his gaze to the window, trying to keep his frustration inside. And in the corner of his mind, Enji Todoroki saw the scene again. The alpha voice, the order given, and little Shoto who, despite everything, had found comfort in an outsider. A thought struck him. Perhaps he had moved things in the wrong direction. But he was too proud to admit it out loud. The house was silent when Enji returned to his study, after seeing Izuku come out. The sound of the door closing behind the young Omega resounded in the empty room like a small knock. Enji sat down slowly, his hands on his knees, his gaze fixed on the floor. He saw everything in his mind: Izuku's low, firm voice, the curl of his shoulders as he accepted his order, the way Shoto had looked at the caregiver with that fragile confidence. Enji clenched his jaw. He wasn't just a caregiver, he thought. Not just an outsider. Not a simple servant to be kept at a distance. The thought caused him physical discomfort. It wasn't something he wanted to admit, but he couldn't ignore it. The alpha instinct in him was irritated by the quiet resistance Izuku had shown. Calm, firm, respectful. Yet present enough not to disappear under the weight of his command. Enji closed his eyes for a moment. His heartbeat was slow, measured. It wasn't anger, not completely. It was restlessness. A feeling he couldn't control. Did I cross the line today? The question hit him hard, but there was no one to ask it. The children were silent, and Izuku had already left the house. He opened his eyes. He found no answer. Only the silence of his studio, the sound of his breathing, and the awareness that something had changed. Meanwhile, Izuku walked along the path that led to his house. Every step was heavy. Not because of physical fatigue. Not for the long day at work. It was the weight of decisions. The day before he had seen too much. The day before he had heard too much. And today, in the silence of the morning, she had understood how fragile the boundary was between her role and what was really happening between the members of the Todoroki family. He paused for a moment and looked up at the sky. The light was warm, but my heart was cold. I can't, he thought. I can't become part of this family. Not in this way. The thought tormented him. Every time he remembered Shoto, sitting down to eat slowly, the little Omega perfume full of fear and need, he felt a grip in his stomach. But it was precisely this need that reminded him of limits. He was not a parent, he was not a hero, he was not an alpha. Only a reliable Omega, as long as his role was clear. Izuku arrived at the front door of his house. He stopped. His heart was beating fast. He breathed deeply. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe I shouldn't come back. A dangerous thought. But he did not say it aloud. He would never admit to anyone how much it had shaken him that day, how much Enji's alpha voice and the consequences on Shoto's eyes had touched him. He entered, closing the door behind him, and dropped down on the sofa. The Todoroki house was still full of tension, even after Izuku was gone. Shoto sat by the window, his hands clasped on his knees, looking out without really seeing. Her Omega scent was still tense, flickering, as if her body remained on alert even when the threat was over. Natsuo was silently watching his little brother. He didn't speak, but his eyes said it all. He recognized the suffering, he understood the trauma, and yet he didn't know how to help. Tuya, sitting in the other room, clenched his fists. Her alpha scent oscillated between frustration and restrained anger. There was no anger towards Izuku, but towards himself, towards his father, towards that routine that forced everyone to push themselves beyond the limit. Enji remained in his study for a long time, reflecting. There was no blame to be attributed, only awareness. I spoke with Izuku. I imposed my authority. I pushed Tuya and Shoto to the limit, and little Shoto found solace in a stranger. That thought irritated him. It disturbed him. But he could not admit any mistake. He got up and walked slowly down the room. It's not his role. And yet, he did not finish the sentence. There was no need. Even in the solitude of his studio, the echo of his alpha words still seemed present in the house, as a constant reminder of the boundaries and lines not to be crossed. Izuku, sitting on the couch, closed his eyes for a moment. He considered the possibility of leaving. It was not escape. It was protection. For himself and, in some way, for Shoto. The idea of continuing to move through those tensions, of witnessing alpha commands and extreme efforts of children, made him uncomfortable. If I stay, what will I become? He thought. The image of Shoto seeking his presence, his pale face and trembling hands, filled his mind. He was not ready to leave the child alone. But staying meant taking the risk of interfering, of crossing Enji's invisible lines. Izuku opened his eyes slowly. He looked at the room around him. Silent. orderly, welcoming, yet full of invisible tension. Tomorrow, I will decide. He got up. She prepared her clothes for the next day. He fixed some things that had been left in disorder. He didn't say anything out loud. No one was there to listen. Finally, before going to sleep, he looked out the window. The Todoroki mansion was far away, visible among the city lights. The thought of Enji's alpha voice, of the children, of their reactions, left a lump in his stomach. It wasn't anger. It was not fear. It was awareness. It is a silent decision, still suspended, waiting to be made. The Todoroki villa was bathed in the warm afternoon light. Izuku tidied up the living room, calmly folded the pillows, and dusted the shelves. Every gesture was measured, precise, as if maintaining order could instill a little stability in the house, and perhaps even in himself. Shoto was sitting on the tatami, his shoulders hunched, his head down. He didn't move, but he couldn't concentrate. Izuku immediately noticed the omega scent changing, more intense, more unstable. There was something in the air that went beyond the normal tension. "Shoto, is everything okay?" he asked softly, slowly approaching. The child did not answer. He was shaking slightly, his hands clasped in his lap. His pale face was covered by unkempt red and white hair. Then, suddenly, the dam gave way. Tears began to flow down Shoto's face. Small sobs escaped from her pursed lips. The tension accumulated in the previous days, the pain, fear, and insecurity exploded in a moment that no one had foreseen. Izuku slowly crouched in front of him. "Shoto, it's all right," he whispered in a tone so calm that it sounded like an anchor. The little omega trembled, his body tense like a bow ready to shoot, but Izuku's presence was reassuring. He didn't impose anything. He didn't speak on command. He didn't try to correct or check. He just stood there, as if his existence was enough to say, "You're not alone." Shoto lowered his head to Izuku's arm. A small cry, subtle but intense. Izuku placed a hand on the child's back. He felt the fragile heat. He perceived the omega smell, delicate, afraid, but authentic. "It's not your fault," he said softly. "You're not weak to cry." The words flowed slowly, unhurriedly. Shoto inhaled, trembling. "But let go." Izuku stayed by his side until the crying subsided, until the sobs became slow, regular breaths. When Shoto finally looked up, his heterochrome eyes were still shiny, but there was a glimmer of confidence, a thin thread of confidence. Izuku smiled softly. "We can arrange the room together now, if you like." Shoto nodded slightly. It wasn't a full smile, but it was a step. As they settled together, Izuku watched the boy closely. He didn't talk about Tuya's anger or Enji's severe DSPLN. He didn't comment on the invisible lines between them. He knew that the little omega needed stability, not judgment. Shoto's every gesture was measured, every movement attentive, as if it were testing the world around it. Izuku limited himself to following, supporting, making himself present without invading. Finally, after arranging the toys and books, Shoto lay down on the tatami. He breathed slowly, his body finally relaxed. Izuku looked at him for a moment. He understood something fundamental. "I have to stay." It was not a decision made out of pride or a sense of duty. It was instinct, protection, and perhaps, for the first time, something that went beyond the simple role of caregiver. Meanwhile, Enji was sitting in his office taking care of various duties. He began to remember what happened 2 days ago and having used the alpha voice. He left his papers aside and relaxed in his chair and began to reflect. "I used my alpha voice. I imposed my order without considering the fragility of children, without evaluating the effect on others." Pride burned in his throat. He was not a man to admit mistakes easily. But something inside him had changed. He looked at Izuku. Calm, respectful, but present. He had not left after the order. He had not reacted with rebellion, but with discreet firmness. Enji inhaled slowly. He knew what he had to do. "I have to apologize." Not because Izuku was superior or stronger, but because it was right. For the first time in many years, Enji Todoroki recognized that the way he had treated someone had crossed the line, although he remained convinced that the caregiver should not interfere in the running of the family. Enji sat a little longer, watching the sun begin to set, giving way to the evening. Izuku is necessary, he thought. It cannot be just an external presence. But he must not intrude. That realization left him with a knot in his stomach. But for now, he knew what to do: apologize. And to understand, slowly, where the boundary between authority and care had to be drawn. Evening fell on the Todoroki villa with a soft orange light filtering through the curtains. The house was tidy, the sense of the imminent meal mingled with the air already full of tension. Izuku had already prepared everything: steaming rice in the donburi, hot miso, and some steamed vegetables. Each dish was carefully arranged on the low table in the dining room, following the usual order. Shoto sat down first, his hands clasped on his lap. The little Omega was still shaking slightly, but this afternoon's crying had freed him from some of the accumulated tension. Natsuo watched in silence, ready to support his brother, while Tuya, as always, moved with a decisive step, sitting down speechless, his face stern and his gaze sharp. Izuku served the dishes without a comment, keeping the tone calm, neutral. He knew that today was a delicate day. The silence of the villa, the residual tension, the emotional weight of the afternoon. Everything had to be managed without speeding up the pace. Enji returned shortly after. Its alpha presence was immediately noticeable, a slight change in the air, the scent oscillating between strength and control. "Everyone to the table," he ordered, but his voice was more measured than usual. The children got up immediately, a little calmer, as if their father's tone had shifted the tension. Enji sat down at the head of the table. He looked at the dishes arranged and, without saying a word, began to eat. The silence that followed was not heavy. He was attentive, observatory. Each bite was measured, as if Enji were calibrating his actions and reactions, learning to read the environment after the tension of the previous day. Izuku sat to the side, as always, ready to intervene only if necessary. Shoto barely looked at him, with a small nod of recognition. Natsuo nodded slightly to Izuku as if to say, "You did well." Tuya, staring at his plate, said nothing. But his posture was less rigid, a sign of a little relaxation. After dinner, Enji got up. "Midoriya, come with me," he said, without preamble. Izuku felt a shiver run down his spine. Every fiber of his body reacted immediately. Dismissal? Did I do something wrong? Enji's voice was calm, but each Omega feels the weight of a determined alpha. Izuku nodded, following the number 1 toward the study. Each step was punctuated, slow, as if walking were a test. As they walked through the hallway, Izuku tried to prepare himself mentally. He went over every possible mistake, everything he had done during the day. The paranoia grew. Will he tell me to leave? Maybe I'm not good enough. I did something wrong. Maybe it's because of what happened 2 days ago. They arrived at the studio. Enji closed the door behind them. Izuku inhaled deeply. He tried to maintain a neutral expression. The body was tense. My heart was beating fast. "Midoriya," Enji began, without looking at him immediately. "About the day before yesterday." Izuku sighed softly, fearing the worst. Enji looked up. His eyes were fixed on Izuku, but the usual alpha fire was tempered by a sense of introspection. "I want to apologize," said Enji, with a sincerity that few could ever have felt. "For the tone. Because of the way I spoke to you." Izuku inhaled, almost incredulous. "Yes, sir." "Don't get me wrong," Enji continued, his voice firmer but calmer. "Your role in this house remains the same. You must not interfere in my decisions or those of my children." Izuku nodded slowly, feeling a weight lift, but cautiously. The mind still worked out the excuse of the proudest alpha he knew. "But," Enji continued, with a small gesture of his hand, as if to emphasize the sincerity, "you must know that. You are useful. For Shoto. For children. For me, indirectly." Izuku looked down, his heart pounding. "Thank you, sir." Enji said no more. The silence in the room was full of meaning. It was not complicity, it was not yielding. It was just understanding. Izuku stood up slowly, as if walking had become lighter. Tomorrow I'll continue to do my best, he said. Calmly, but with a determination that NG couldn't ignore. NG nodded. Good. And for a moment, the tension that had dominated the day seemed to subside, giving way to a fragile stillness. The sun filtered through the large sliding windows of the Todoroki villa, illuminating the tatami floor as if each ray wanted to make the house warmer and more welcoming. The villa was immense, with large rooms, essential but elegant furnishings, and a well-kept garden with bonsai and stones that separated the paths between small bridges. The morning light slipped on the smooth wood, entering the kitchen where Izuku, as every day for a month now, moved calmly. He had learned the rhythms of the house, the children's steps, the sense of each room, even NG's little ticks when he came in and out. Her routine had become a delicate dance, waking up the children, preparing breakfast, organizing the day. There was no longer that paralyzing tension of the first days. Not entirely, but enough to make the house livable. Shoto was already awake, sitting on the futon, with unkempt hair and his gaze still a little sleepy. The little Omega had been watching him for a few days without fear. When Izuku entered the room, Shoto greeted him with a small wave of his hand, a simple but trusting gesture. "Good morning, Shoto," Izuku said with a soft smile. "Did you sleep well?" Shoto nodded, speechless, but with a flash of confidence in his eyes. He stood up slowly, his small feet gently touching the tatami, and approached Izuku as he prepared breakfast. The scent of rice, miso and tamago dawn filled the air. Tuya and Natsuo arrived shortly after. Tuya with heavy but less hostile steps, Natsuo with that observational calm that had now become natural. They both sat at the table speechless, but Izuku sensed a change. There was no hostility in their eyes, only curiosity and a cautious acceptance. The meal passed in measured silence. Shoto spoke at times, asking small things about how to cook an ingredient or what was the best way to fold a tablecloth. Izuku responded calmly, explaining without imposing rules, as if every gesture was part of a small daily teaching. Tuya watched silently, but every now and then he glanced at Izuku, as if to record his calmness, the way he cared for children without interfering in their family dynamics. Natsuo spoke intermittently, sharing brief observations about the school or a book, and Izuku listened attentively, without judgment, offering practical advice. After breakfast, Izuku drove the children to school. Shoto walked beside him, his hands clasped behind his back, more confident. Tuya and Natsuo followed him with a firm step, occasionally talking to each other, with Izuku listening to them without intervening unless necessary. Back in the mansion, Izuku began to tidy up the house. He cleaned the floors, reorganized the kitchen, arranged the living room cushions. Every gesture was regular, almost meditative. He could smell Shoto's Omega scent still lingering in the air, a reminder of the morning and the small emotional progress the baby had made. The garden was his next space. He took out the most delicate plants, watering carefully and moving some stones to make the path more harmonious. The Todoroki villa had always been elegant, but Izuku added small daily attentions, making the environment more welcoming even for children. When he returned to the house to prepare lunch, Shoto watched him closely. He was no longer fearful but curious. "Izuku, can I help?" he asked timidly. Izuku smiled. "Of course, Shoto. Do you want to cut vegetables?" The boy nodded, taking a small safety knife under Izuku's careful supervision. His movements were uncertain at first, but as time passed, he began to feel capable. Every now and then he glanced at Izuku, receiving a little encouragement with a nod. Tuya passed into the kitchen shortly after, watching Shoto cut vegetables. The elder brother did not intervene, but the silent respect he exuded was evident. Natsuo joined shortly, proposing a small change to the arrangement of the dishes, and Izuku greeted the suggestions with a smile. The preparation of lunch thus became a moment of collaboration, small but significant, where the children began to trust the Omega and feel secure in his role. During his lunch break, Shoto sat next to Izuku, resting his head on his shoulder for a brief moment, a gesture that a month ago would have been unthinkable. Izuku said nothing, simply letting the child find comfort. That small closeness was a confirmation. The bond between them was getting stronger. The afternoon passed quietly. Izuku helped the children with small tasks or games, watching Tuya and Natsuo interact more freely. The small initial tensions had diminished. They were not perfect friends, but there was mutual respect. Shoto, in particular, showed signs of increased confidence. No more silent sobs, no more fear of asking for help. The little Omega learned every day that Izuku's presence was a firm, reliable, and patient point. Izuku took a brief break, sitting near the inner garden, watching the light filtering through the leaves of the bonsai. He thought about how much life had changed in the villa. The first few weeks had been full of tension, fear, and misunderstandings. Now, after a month, he began to perceive a fragile but real balance. When the sun began to set, Izuku prepared dinner. Each dish was arranged with care, as always, but now with the awareness that the children would also appreciate them as a moment of normality and safety. Shoto arrived first, sitting calmly. Tuya and Natsuo followed him shortly after, with a more relaxed attitude than in the first weeks. The silence at the table was more serene, interspersed with small conversations. Shoto asked how to cook a dish. Tuya made a quick remark on a game. Natsuo commented on a school story. Izuku observed everything, without intervening in vain. Every small gesture, every word of the children, was a signal. Trust grew, slowly but surely. At the end of the day, after setting up the kitchen and preparing everything for the next day, Izuku sat on the tatami mat next to Shoto. The boy rested his head on his arm. This time there was no fear, only security. Izuku closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in Shoto's omega scent and the warmth it gave off. That's why I have to stay, he thought. Despite everything. For him, for them. And for the first time in a month, he felt that the Todoroki villa was not just a place of work. It was home. The sun had now set behind the Todoroki mansion, tinging the rooms a soft orange. The day had passed without major problems. The children had done their homework, played in the courtyard, and helped Izuku with small chores around the house. Shoto, however, had had a small accident that afternoon. As he tried to mimic a light balance exercise in the living room, he lost his balance and lightly tapped his knee against the edge of the table. The little Omega had immediately curled up, breathing in sobs, his eyes shining with pain and frustration. Izuku had rushed in an instant, his hand firmly on Shoto's knee to assess the severity of the blow. Okay, Shoto, it's nothing serious. Look, it's not bleeding, he said in a calm, reassuring voice. The baby's omega scent was intense, almost palpable, and Izuku felt his heart tighten. Shoto was shaking slightly, but Izuku's nearby presence was enough to calm some of the fear. The boy helped him sit on the tatami, removing any nearby obstacles and gently massaging the painful area. Sorry, Shoto murmured, his voice broken with emotion. You don't have to apologize, Izuku replied, placing a hand on his shoulder. We can all fall, we can all hurt ourselves. It's not your fault. The little Omega inhaled deeply and let go, his body more relaxed. For the first time in a month, there was no fear between them, only trust and security. Shoto leaned on Izuku, who stayed close until the baby's breathing became regular again and the omega scent became more stable, calmer. Meanwhile, Enji returned home. The orange light of the sunset illuminated the villa, and the scent of cooking and children mingled in the air. Entering the living room, he immediately perceived the unusual calm. He saw Shoto sitting next to Izuku, with a calm look and his hands resting on the tatami. Tuya and Natsuo watched in silence, but with relaxed postures. Izuku stood up slightly, respectfully, without making any intrusive gestures, and nodded to Enji. The number one stopped. He inhaled deeply. He looked at the scene in front of him, Shoto safer, calmer, more protected, Izuku next to him, calm and present, Tuya and Natsuo less rigid and hostile. This quiet. It's thanks to him, Enji thought, while mentally reiterating the boundaries. He must not interfere in my decisions. But it is clear that without him the family would be more fragile. Pride forced him not to admit recognition too openly, but the facts spoke for themselves. The little Omega had gained trust, and the brothers had learned to respect him, to trust him. Enji advanced into the living room and looked at Shoto. The boy looked at him for a moment, then turned to Izuku with a small, almost imperceptible smile. NG felt the affection, the security transmitted by the caregiver, and the sense of protection that was growing in the little one. Dinner was more serene than usual. Izuku had prepared the meal as usual: rice, miso, steamed fish, and vegetables. Shoto was actively involved, offering small observations on how to arrange the dishes. Tuya and Natsuo exchanged brief words with Izuku, bringing out a more relaxed and natural dynamic. NG watched everything silent. His alpha presence was less oppressive than usual, as if he was calibrating his authority, carefully choosing when to intervene and when to let it go. When the dinner was over, NG got up. "Izuku, come to my studio," he said, calmly but with the weight of his alpha voice. Izuku immediately felt the anxiety growing. Every fiber of his body strained. Did I do something wrong? Will he fire me? Paranoia assailed him, imagining worst-case scenarios: being sent away, betraying NG's trust, interfering too much with the children. He followed NG into the study, his mind in turmoil. The door closed behind them. Izuku stopped, waiting, breathing slowly to calm down. NG looked at him, his look serious but not angry. "Today, you handled the situation with Shoto well," he began. Izuku inhaled, trying not to panic. "Yes, sir." "Don't get me wrong," NG continued, "your role doesn't change. You must not interfere in my decisions or those of my children." Izuku nodded slowly, his mind still in alarm, but careful with his words. "But today," NG continued, "you made a difference for Shoto. You handled the situation calmly and presently, and this is something that must be recognized. It's not your job to interfere, but that doesn't mean you're not important." Izuku felt a weight lift from his chest. He breathed deeply, aware of the delicacy of the words. "Thank you, sir." NG nodded his head a little. It wasn't a full smile, but there was implicit approval in his eyes. "Keep it up. But always remember your role." Izuku nodded again. He felt the tension diminishing, replaced by a sense of responsibility and motivation. Leaving the study, Izuku returned to the living room. The children watched him from afar, curious, but with a new confidence in their eyes. Shoto looked at him and made a small gesture, a wave with his hand as if to say, "Thank you." Izuku smiled slightly, returning the gesture without words. Tuya and Natsuo remained silent, but their respect was evident in their relaxed posture and small signs of attention to the caregiver. Izuku sat next to Shoto for a moment, observing the quiet of the house. The warm light of the sunset filtered through the tents, creating an atmosphere of tranquility and security. "That's what I'm staying for," he thought. "For Shoto, for children, and maybe even for myself. This house, this family needs me. And I need them." The evening closed slowly, with the Todoroki villa immersed in a silence full of meaning. The tension of the past month had not completely disappeared, but the bonds built, small and fragile, had created a solid foundation. Izuku, before retiring to his room, watched little Shoto sleep peacefully on the sofa, Tuya intent on arranging a book and Natsuo casting a curious glance at his little brother. A sense of accomplishment pervaded him. His role was not just as a caregiver, he had become a silent pillar of security and stability. And for the first time in weeks, he felt he could face tomorrow with the certainty of having a place in the Todoroki family. The morning in the Villa Todoroki was clear. The sun streamed in through the large sliding windows, illuminating the tatami mat and making the smooth wood of the corridors shine. The air was fresh, and even the scent of garden plants filtered through the open doors, mixing with the classic aroma of rice and miso that Izuku was preparing for breakfast. Izuku moved calmly in the spacious kitchen. The Todoroki villa was large, elegant, with large and bright rooms, impeccable tatami floors and walls in sober tones. The paper curtains filtered the light, creating delicate plays on the light wood. Every morning, for 2 months now, Izuku had been walking the same path, waking up the children, preparing breakfast, tidying up the house and making sure that the children's routine went smoothly. Shoto was already awake, sitting on the futon, his unkempt hair falling over his face. His heterochrome eyes, green and gray, were still sleepy, but there was a new serenity. When Izuku entered the room, Shoto barely looked up and nodded a little. It was not fear, it was not mistrust. It was trust. "Good morning, Shoto," Izuku said softly, smiling. "Did you sleep well?" The little Omega nodded and slowly stood up. The small feet touched the tatami with delicacy. He approached Izuku as he spread out the plates and poured the steaming rice into the donburi. The scent of egg, miso, and freshly cooked rice filled the air. Tuya and Natsuo arrived shortly after, with calmer steps than before. Tuya walked confidently as always, his gaze attentive, while Natsuo followed with the calm air that distinguished him. Both sat down at the table, without hostility or hesitation. Breakfast was quiet. Shoto would talk at times, asking Izuku how to properly cut vegetables or what was the best way to arrange the dishes. Izuku answered calmly, without haste, without imposing anything. Every word was measured, designed to instill confidence without commanding. Tuya watched silently, mentally noting Izuku's gestures. Every movement was delicate, attentive, respectful of the children but firm in the management of the house. Natsuo, on the other hand, briefly commented on the books he was reading or the small tasks to be done, receiving practical and kind advice from Izuku, without him ever diminishing the boy's opinions. Shoto, meanwhile, had begun to show small gestures of affection. He leaned lightly on Izuku as he took the rice, or talked to him with increasing confidence. The shyness of the early days was now a distant memory, replaced by a silent but solid trust. After breakfast, Izuku drove the children to school. Shoto walked beside him, his hands behind his back, his posture more confident and relaxed. Tuya and Natsuo followed them, talking to each other naturally, without the rigidity of the first weeks. Izuku's presence was reassuring. He did not impose anything, he did not correct and did not judge. It was a fixed point, stable and predictable. Back in the mansion, Izuku immediately got to work. He cleaned the floors carefully, tidied up the kitchen, and tidied up each room as routine. Each gesture had the precision of a ritual, yet there was something meditative in those actions. He allowed himself the luxury of observing the details, the light that filtered through the bonsai trees in the garden, the slight residual omega scent of Shoto that still permeated the house, the light silence of the tatami under his feet. When he began to prepare lunch, Shoto watched him from afar, curious. Then, with a little hesitation, he asked, "Can I help, Izuku?" Izuku smiled, walking closer to him. "Of course, Shoto. Do you want to cut vegetables?" The boy nodded enthusiastically. Izuku handed him a small safety knife and slowly guided him. The first cuts were uncertain, shaky, but Shoto learned quickly. Every now and then he looked up at Izuku, receiving a small nod of approval or a smile. Trust grew, day after day, in small concrete gestures. Tuya passed into the kitchen shortly after, watching Shoto closely. He did not intervene, but the silent respect in his eyes was evident. Natsuo joined in shortly after, suggesting how to arrange the dishes in a more orderly manner, and Izuku welcomed the advice with a smile. The preparation of the lunch thus turned into a moment of collaboration, small but significant, where mutual trust and affection became tangible. In the afternoon, while the children were doing their homework, Izuku watched them carefully. Shoto was more confident, focused on the papers in front of him, but every now and then he turned to Izuku for advice or encouragement. Tuya and Natsuo were more relaxed. They talked to each other, laughed softly, giving a glimpse of a more natural family dynamic. Izuku took advantage of a moment of calm to sit by the living room window, watching the light go down on the inner garden. The sun filtered through the bonsai branches, creating delicate shadows on the floor. He breathed slowly, enjoying the silence, the apparent peace. He thought about how much life in the villa had changed in a month, from the first days of tension and fear to the fragile but real stability of now. Every small gesture of the children, every hidden smile, every word of Shoto or comment of Tuya and Natsuo was a confirmation that trust was being built, stone by stone. Izuku felt that he belonged to that family, even if his role remained limited by respect for Enji's rules. When the sun began to set, Izuku prepared dinner. Rice, miso, steamed fish and well-arranged vegetables. Shoto arrived first, sitting calmly and watching Izuku move between the stoves. Tuya and Natsuo followed him, more relaxed than in the first few weeks. The dinner was serene. Small exchanges of jokes, restrained laughter, barely perceptible gestures of affection. Shoto touched Izuku's hand while he was taking the rice. Natsuo commented on a book or an assignment. Tuya launched brief observations in a serious but respectful tone. Enji, back in the house, watched them from afar. Its alpha presence was perceptible, but the tension was minimal. He noticed every gesture, Izuku's calmness, the children's progress, Tuya and Natsuo's silent respect. It made all the difference, Enji thought, reflecting on the past month. He must not interfere in my decisions, but without him the family would be more fragile. After dinner, Izuku helped Shoto arrange the dishes and games. The child, tired but serene, approached him, resting his head on the Omega's arm. A simple gesture but full of trust. Izuku gently stroked it, letting the little one relax. Tuya and Natsuo retired for their evening activities, unhurried but with a renewed sense of security. The villa was calm. Every detail, the tatame, the soft lighting, the light and stable Omega scent, contributed to creating an atmosphere of fragile but real quiet. Izuku sat next to Shoto, watching the children settle down for the night. He reflected on the month that had just passed, the first days full of tension, the fear of not being accepted, Enji's strict rules, and then the growth, the trust, the small bonds that had been created. This is my family now, he thought. Even if my role is limited, I am essential to them. And I need them. With this thought, he closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a new serenity. The Todoroki mansion, with all its rules, secrets, and tensions, had become home. And for the first time in weeks, Izuku felt he could face tomorrow with the certainty of having a place there, next to the children and more quietly, under Enji's watchful gaze. The afternoon in the Todoroki villa was calm, at least on the surface. The sun filtered through the large sliding windows, illuminating the rooms with a golden glow, but the air inside the house was charged with tension. Izuku was tidying up the kitchen after preparing the snack for the children, arranging plates and glasses with his usual care. His breathing was calm as always, but something in the air made him feel that this would be a more complicated day than usual. Shoto was busy with a board game, concentrated, while Natsuo read a book in silence on the tatame. Tuya, on the other hand, paced back and forth through the kitchen, visibly irritated. His heavy footsteps made the floor vibrate slightly, and his eyes cast quick glances at Izuku, who tried to keep calm and not provoke his older brother any further. Izuku, Tuya began in a cold tone. Why do you always put everything in order like this? You're not our maid. Izuku sighed slightly, not losing his temper. Tuya, I'm just trying to fix things so that the house stays tidy. It's easier that way for everyone. Tuya pursed his lips, shaking his head. Yes, but it's not your job to do everything. You're here to be a caregiver for children. Don't pretend to be in charge here too. Tuya's tone was grumpy, prickly, but Izuku stood firm, trying not to react with hostility. I'm not trying to command. I'm just helping. If there's something you want to do differently, we can talk about it. But Tuya did not calm down. The boy's frustration, accumulated for weeks, suddenly exploded. You don't understand, do you? You don't understand anything at all. You're alone. An Omega. An Omega that comes down to doing the job of a caregiver to earn a living. You have neither power nor authority here. And look at you. Always servile, always trying to please everyone. The blow was very hard. Tuya's words were sharp, directed at Izuku's heart. Every heavy insult, every sentence that reminded him of his Omega condition, made Izuku's chest vibrate. He tried to hold back his tears, but the lump in his throat was too strong, and his eyes began to become shiny. Tuya, murmured Izuku, his voice trembling. Please. Tuya, caught up in his outburst, continued without realizing the gravity of what he was saying. You are nobody. You don't deserve anything. You're just a servant in this house, and... Then suddenly he stopped. He saw tears slowly rolling down Izuku's face. The shadow of surprise passed over his eyes, and his breath failed him for an instant. She didn't expect to see the boy crying, so vulnerable, so human. The anger gave way to embarrassment and the awareness of having exceeded all limits. Before he could say anything, the front door of the villa opened with a strong sound. Enji had returned home. His alpha presence immediately filled the room, a combination of authority and control that made Tuya stiffen and Izuku hold his breath. The little Omega hurried to hide his tears, wiping his face with his hands. He forced himself to smile, a fake but believable smile, and turned to Enji with apparent calm. "Good morning, sir." Enji entered the room and raised an eyebrow, immediately sensing that something was wrong. Izuku's smile, however, was convincing. He said nothing, but his scrutinizing gaze left no escape. Tuya withdrew, embarrassed and taken by surprise. He didn't know how to react to the situation and didn't dare say anything with Enji present. Shoto observed everything in silence, not fully understanding the gravity of the exchange, but sensing the tense atmosphere. Natsuo, on the other hand, was motionless, with wide eyes, aware that he had witnessed something important. Izuku moved quickly, heading to the kitchen to serve dinner. Every gesture was measured, precise, as if nothing had happened. He arranged the dishes on the table, handed each child his own rice and vegetables, all with the calm and courtesy that distinguished him. "Bon appetit," he said in a firm voice, but in his heart an enormous weight. Enji sat down, watching the scene. He noticed the tension in Izuku's movements, the stiffness in his body, and the slight contraction of his shoulders. He said nothing, but his gaze betrayed him. Something had happened. The dinner proceeded in silence, interrupted only by the children's small comments about the food. Tuya avoided looking at Izuku, the guilt and embarrassment weighed on him, but the anger and frustration had not completely disappeared. Shoto ate slowly, occasionally glancing at Izuku with an expression of curiosity and concern. Natsuo observed everything, ready to report, if necessary, without malice but moved by the natural curiosity of an older brother. When the dinner was over, Izuku got up to arrange the dishes, being careful not to leave any marks of the tears he had just hidden. Every gesture was calculated, elegant in its simplicity, yet every movement betrayed a minimal residual tension. "Good," Enji said firmly, noticing the change in the atmosphere. "Is everything okay?" Izuku nodded, his usual polite smile. "Yes, sir." But the man immediately noticed the shadow of pain in his eyes, even if it was hidden behind the mask of calm. The way he served the dishes, the barely perceptible trembling in his hands, all indicated that something had happened before he returned. Tuya bit his lip, looking at the floor. He couldn't say anything without drawing Enji's attention to himself. Guilt was slowly overpowering him, but anger and pride did not allow him to apologize immediately. Shoto, sitting next to Izuku, felt the weight of the tension but did not fully understand. He just looked at the little Omega with concern, sensing that something was wrong. Finally, Natsuo observed the scene carefully, ready to report what happened if necessary, without the intention of creating problems but with a sincerity typical of his age. Izuku paused for a moment, breathing deeply and trying to calm down. She wiped away the last remaining tears and forced herself to smile. "Good evening," he said in a firm but gentle tone. Then, as always, he left the house to return to his home. Dinner was over, and the air in the Todoroki villa was filled with a heavy silence. Izuku had served the dishes with his usual precision, maintaining his polite and fake smile despite the tears he had hidden just before. Every gesture was calculated, precise, but the Omega's heart still beat fast for Tuya's words. The children had begun to eat in silence, while Tuya sat with his gaze downcast, aware of the seriousness of his actions. Shoto, sitting next to Izuku, watched him with concern, sensing that something was wrong, while Natsuo seemed ready to report everything to his father. Izuku, after arranging the dishes, stood up and, with a respectful nod, greeted Enji and the children. "Good evening," he said in a calm and composed voice. Then he headed for the door, ready to go back to his home. Each step was measured, as if he was trying not to leave any traces of his pain. Enji watched him intently as he walked away. The villa, illuminated by the warm lights of the chandeliers, seemed quiet, but he felt every tension in the boy's movements. That fake smile, that calm air, nothing could completely hide Izuku's emotions. As Izuku walked out of the mansion and the door closed behind him, Enji inhaled deeply, feeling anger and worry mingle within him. He could no longer ignore the situation. He knew that something had happened that had hurt Izuku, even though he had tried to hide it. "Tuya," he said at last, in a firm voice, "tell me exactly what happened." Tuya lowered his head, hesitant. I said things to Izuku. Bad things." The boy's voice was a mixture of pent-up anger and guilt. Shoto and Natsuo remained silent, watching the scene, while Enji continued to stare at Tuya. His gaze was stern, but not without attention and concern. "What did you tell him?" he asked. Tuya reluctantly confessed to the insults he had directed at Izuku, talking about his being an Omega and his role as a caregiver. The confession was painful to hear, but necessary. Enji clenched his fists, anger mixed with worry. "This is unacceptable. I will never tolerate insults like that, especially from you, Tuya. Tomorrow you will apologize to Izuku. Do you understand?" Tuya nodded, silently, aware that his father's punishment would be severe. He did not dare to look up, the weight of guilt oppressed him. Enji inhaled deeply. Izuku's absence worried him more than he would have liked to admit. "Well," he said, trying to keep calm, "tomorrow Tuya will have to apologize. And you too," Shoto and Natsuo looked at, "learn to recognize when someone is hurt. Never ignore the pain of others." That night, Enji sat in his office, his hands clasped in front of him, reflecting on the evening. The thought of Izuku, out there at home, troubled him. She had seen that boy calm down and hide the pain with dignity and patience, but the wound was evident. He did much more than he should, Enji thought, clenching his jaw. Yet he did not let himself be overwhelmed, he kept calm even when Tuya. Anger at Tuya's behavior was mixed with a quiet respect for the Omega. He was a brave boy, who had shown strength even in pain. The villa, immersed in the silence of the night, seemed to breathe with him. The soft light of the chandeliers illuminated the empty rooms, while Enji reflected on the consequences of Tuya's words and Izuku's absence. He knew that the next day would be delicate. Tuya would have to apologize, and Izuku. "We hope that this situation will be resolved quickly." The next day, the villa woke up as usual, with the sun filtering through the large windows. The children moved slowly, Shoto sleepy but worried, Tuya still agitated and aware of the impending punishment. When Enji entered the kitchen, he immediately noticed Izuku's absence. There was no trace of the boy, neither to prepare breakfast nor to take care of the children. "Where is Izuku?" asked Enji, his voice firm and slightly tense. Shoto, in a faint voice, replied, "I don't know, Dad. Last night he returned to his home. And he didn't come this morning." Natsuo, sincere and direct as always, added, "Yes, Dad. After what happened yesterday, Izuku didn't come. He stayed at home." Enji clenched his jaws. Anger and worry mingled, but he tried to keep calm. The boy's absence was not just a sign of disappointment, it was a consequence of Tuya's words. Father number one had to handle the situation firmly, without losing lucidity. Tuya, sitting at the table, felt the weight of his actions more than ever. Not only had he hurt someone who cared for them, but now that absence was evident and heavy. The boy trembled, aware that paternal punishment would only be part of the lesson. Shoto, sitting next to the table, looked at the door with a worried look. Izuku's absence created a concrete void in his routine, and the little Omega was now an integral part of the family, even if he did not live in the mansion. Enji inhaled deeply, staring at his children and then looking into the void beyond the windows. He had to act, but carefully. Tuya should have apologized, but Izuku should not feel pressured to return. He had to be convinced that the family was ready to protect and respect him. The day continued with the children quieter than usual, each sensing the tension created by Izuku's absence. The villa, usually lively and full of energy, was immersed in a silence full of expectation and concern. Izuku's absence had created an invisible rift in the family dynamic, and Enji knew that this would not be a simple day like any other. The situation required patience, firmness, and sensitivity. It had to be a delicate balance between authority and attention to the feelings of the children and the young Omega. And so, with the sun illuminating the villa, Izuku's absence became the central node of the day, a signal that the Todoroki family could not ignore. a small void that promised to bring out tensions and feelings that were never fully explored. The morning came slowly, accompanied by a gray light that barely filtered through the worn curtains of Izuku's apartment. The distant noise of the city crept in through the closed windows. Hurried steps, a passing car, the distant call of someone starting their day. Izuku had been awake for some time. He was sitting on the futon, his knees clasped to his chest, his gaze fixed on the floor. He had hardly slept at. Every time he closed his eyes, Tuya's words echoed in his head, raw, sharp, impossible to ignore. Omega. Serval. Reduce yourself to being a caregiver. He inhaled slowly, bringing a hand to his chest, as if he could calm the irregular beating of his heart. It was not the first time he had been insulted for his gender. It was not the first time that someone looked down on him. And yet, this time it hurt more. Perhaps because those words had been said in that house. Maybe because, for the first time in a long time, Izuku had begun to feel useful, accepted, necessary. He got up slowly, going towards the small kitchen. The apartment was modest, basic. A table for 2 people, a slightly ruined sideboard, mismatched crockery. Everything spoke of a life built with effort, step by step, without anyone to really support him. He put on water for tea, more out of habit than out of real desire. His hands were barely shaking. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was the time when usually he was already walking towards the Todoroki villa. The thought made his stomach tighten. Shoto probably was having breakfast. Maybe he would look towards the door, waiting for him. Natsuo would have made a few jokes to break the silence. Tuya's thought made him stiffen. Izuku looked down, clutching his fingers around the still empty cup. I have to go? She wondered. Or is it better to stop? The answer did not come immediately. He sat down at the table, the steam of the tea rising slowly in front of his face. He still felt the weight of that evening on him, the way he had smiled, as always, even as something inside him broke. The way he had served dinner as if nothing had happened. I can't go on like this, he thought. Not if I'm seen that way. Izuku was not naive. He knew well that he was an Omega without a quirk. He knew he had no power in a society that judged him for what he was not. But he had accepted that job with dignity. He had given his all. He had respected Enji's rules, even when they were harsh, even when they hurt. Yet, a sentence from Tuya was enough to bring him back. His cell phone vibrated on the table. Izuku gasped, his heart racing. He looked at him for a few seconds before taking him. No message. Just any notification. He let himself go with a long, tired breath. If I don't go today. The thought frightened him and lifted him at the same time. It was not an escape. Or at least, he tried to convince himself that he wasn't. It was just, take space. Protect yourself. To understand if it was really worth continuing to expose oneself like this, in a house where a boy could destroy it with a few words. He got up and went to the window. He looked at the street below him, the people walking obliviously, each with their own problems. No one knew that there, in that silent apartment, an Omega was considering whether to give up the only stability he had found. Maybe Enji will fire me, he thought suddenly. The idea made his throat tighten. After what had happened, after the tension, after the silence. Perhaps his absence would have been interpreted as a lack of respect. Maybe it was making everything worse. But then Tuya's face came to mind, her eyes full of anger, her voice full of contempt. Izuku closed his eyes. If I come back today, he will pretend nothing happened. If I come back today, I'll pretend I'm okay again. And that realization made him more afraid than any dismissal. He ran a hand through his curly hair, letting himself slide against the wall. His knees gave way slightly, and he sat down on the ground, clasping his arms tightly around himself. He wasn't crying. Not yet. But he felt that knot growing, pressing, ready to explode. Only today, he murmured in a low voice, as if anyone could hear him. Only today I'm staying at home. It was a fragile, uncertain decision. But it was his. Time passed slowly. Izuku tried to tidy up the house, wash the dishes, keep his mind busy. But every gesture reminded him of what he should have been doing elsewhere. Every minute that passed made his absence more real. And a subtle, silent fear grew inside him. What if no one really noticed? As the sun began to rise in the sky, Izuku stopped, looking at his watch again. At that time, Shoto was probably already in business. Perhaps Enji had returned briefly. Maybe. He shook his head. He could not continue to imagine. He sat down on the futon again, his cell phone in his hands. No message. No calls. The silence was deafening. And Izuku understood, with a pang in his chest, that his absence was not just a choice. It was a test. For himself. And for the Todoroki. The Todoroki villa was silent as it rarely happened. It was not the orderly silence of a well-run house, nor the concentrated silence of an ordinary morning. It was an irregular silence, broken by small noises out of place, a hesitant step of Shoto in the corridor, a chair moved for no reason, the clinking of a cup resting to the table. Enji could clearly sense this. He was standing in front of the large window in the living room, his arms folded, his gaze turned outwards without really seeing anything. The sun illuminated the garden, the neat stones, the well-kept trees. Everything was in its place. Yet, something was missing. Izuku didn't come. He didn't need anyone to tell him. He had realized it the moment he had crossed the threshold that morning and had not smelled the familiar scent of omega mixing with the air of the house. There had been no slight noise of the dishes, nor that discreet presence that, within a month, had become part of the routine. A small, seemingly insignificant absence. And yet, Enji closed his eyes for a moment. The night before, it returned to impose itself in his mind with an annoying clarity. The way Izuku had served dinner. That composed, polite smile. And above all, the gaze. It had not been the look of an intimidated Omega. It had been the look of someone who was bearing the pain. Tuya's words came back to him, raw, uncomfortable, impossible to justify. Enji had felt anger mounting in his chest the night before, but only now, with the silence of the house acting as a sounding board, did he really understand its weight. Omega. Serval. Reduce yourself to being a caregiver. Enji clenched his jaw. He had raised his children in DSPLN. In strength. In the idea that the world did not make discounts. But that wasn't training. It was not necessary hardness. It was cruelty. Tuya had crossed a line. Enji inhaled deeply, trying to maintain control. He couldn't afford to react. Instinctively, he was an alpha, number one, a father. Every decision had to be weighed. Yet, he couldn't ignore a thought that kept coming back. Izuku did not respond. He didn't come. And maybe, he won't even come tomorrow. Just imagining that possibility caused a dry pang in his chest. It was not just a matter of work. Izuku was not just any employee. In a short time he had stabilized the house. He had given the children a constant, kind, reliable presence. Shoto trusted him. Natsuo listened to him. Even Tuya, despite everything, had found in him someone against whom to vent her frustration. And Enji had become accustomed to that silent calm. He turned slowly, looking at the room. Shoto was sitting on the tatami, intent on playing, but he was constantly glancing towards the corridor, as if he expected to see Izuku appear at any moment. That detail made his stomach tighten. The children have noticed this. Enji realized, with some discomfort, that the absence of Omega was already having an effect. The house still worked, of course. He was perfectly capable of managing everything. But something was missing that he had never planned, nor openly requested. A balance. He ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture for him. His mind went back to the decision he had made the night before. Tuya would apologize. It was right. Necessary. But now he wondered if it was enough. Apologies do not erase what has been said. Izuku had not responded. He had not protested. He had not demanded explanations. He had simply smiled. And he was gone. That behavior disturbed him more than any outburst. An Omega that raises its voice is easy to manage. An Omega that is silent. Enji looked at his watch. The hour passed. Every minute that passed without news increased an annoying feeling. The awareness of having no control over that situation. I can't force him to come back. And I don't want to do that. The thought surprised him. Since, he wondered, had he started worrying so much about someone else's decisions? He didn't like the answer. Izuku had touched something deep in the dynamics of the house. Not with words, but with presence. With dedication. With silent respect for the rules, even when they were harsh. And Tuya had attacked just that. Enji strinsai pugni. She could not limit herself to making her son apologize. He had to do more. But what? An alpha doesn't easily apologize. An alpha does not admit that he allowed anything wrong to happen under his roof. Yet, if Izuku hadn't returned, that responsibility would have fallen on him as well. The day went on slowly. Enji went out on his busy, but his mind remained anchored to the mansion. Every fight, every meeting, every signature was accompanied by a recurring thought. Tomorrow Tuya would apologize. Tomorrow Izuku, perhaps, would be back. Tomorrow he would have had the opportunity to make up for it. If Izuku returns. When he returned home, the sky was already darkening. The villa was silent again. Too much. Enji paused in the hallway, looking at the empty space where Izuku usually left his bag. There was nothing. He inhaled deeply. Tomorrow, he murmured to himself, almost as if it were a promise. We'll fix everything tomorrow. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't entirely sure. Night fell on the Todoroki mansion with an unnatural calm. And as Enji retired to his office, a certainty began to make its way inside him, uncomfortable and inevitable. If Izuku returned, nothing could have remained exactly as it was before. The third day was the one that made it impossible to pretend. Enji realized this as he entered the house and, for the umpteenth time, he did not perceive any trace of Izuku's presence. No familiar smell in the air, no faint sound of footsteps, no gentle voice announcing that dinner would be ready soon. 3 days. Not 1. Not 2. 3 consecutive days in which Izuku Midoriya had not shown up at the Todoroki mansion. At first, Enji thought it was a malaise. The Omegas were more fragile, physically and emotionally, and after what had happened with Tuya it was plausible that Izuku would have needed time. He had allowed that time without comments, without pressure. On the second day he had started to get annoyed. The third. He had begun to worry. The house felt it. Shoto was quieter than usual. Natsuo spent less time in the common areas. Even Tuya, who had initially shown ostentatious indifference, had stopped provoking and was often locked in his room. It was as if Izuku's absence had left a void that no one could ignore. Enji took off his coat with a dry gesture and left it in the chair. His gaze instinctively rested on the kitchen. Empty. Neat, yes, but impersonal. Cold. It's not like him. Izuku never missed without warning. He was precise, reliable to the point of excess. If he didn't show up, it meant only one thing. He had made a choice. Enji clenched his jaw. That realization struck him more than he was willing to admit. It was not an oversight, it was not a mishap. Izuku was keeping his distance. During the dinner hastily prepared, Enji observed his children one by one. Shoto ate slowly, staring at his plate. Natsuo looked nervous. Tuya carefully avoided meeting his gaze. That was what triggered something. Tuya. Enji's voice was low, controlled, but enough to make the air stiffen. Tuya looked up, annoyed. What's the matter? You have to apologize again to Izuku. Tuya clenched his jaw. You already said I had to do it, but if he doesn't show up. And you will. Enji stood up. But not tomorrow. Not anymore. Tuya looked at him, confused. What does that mean? Enji inhaled slowly. The decision had been forming inside him for hours, perhaps days. Now it was clear. It means, he said, that you will come with me. Tuya's eyes widened. Where? At Izuku Midoriya's house. The name resounded in the room like a sharp blow. What? Tuya jumped to his feet. You can't be serious. I am. Enji's voice did not allow for replies. If Izuku has stopped coming here, it's because he doesn't feel safe anymore. And this happened under my roof. Tuya swallowed. So what? And so, Enji concluded, staring him straight in the eye, we won't wait for him to come back. We will be the ones to go to him. And you will apologize. Looking him in the face. Tuya remained motionless. For the first time, he didn't have a ready answer. The thought of being in front of Izuku, after making him cry, made his stomach tighten in an annoying way. Enji turned to the corridor, already decided. Izuku had chosen to walk away. Now it was their turn to take the first step. And Enji had no idea what he would find once he got to that door. The neighborhood where Izuku lived was quiet, away from the hustle and bustle of downtown and even further away from the glitz of the Todoroki mansion. Low houses, narrow streets, an almost anonymous atmosphere. Enji parked without saying a word. Tuya got out of the car with stiff movements, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket as if they could hide the weight on him. In front of that door, the arrogance that had always accompanied him suddenly seemed out of place. Enji knocked. Then a second. For a moment, Tuya hoped no one would answer. It would have been easier. It would have been easier to go back and pretend that Izuku was just a caregiver who had quit her job. The door opened slowly. Izuku appeared in the doorway with a baggy sweater, too big for his slender body, and his hair tousled as if he hadn't really slept. His eyes lit up for a moment at the sight of Enji. Then they stopped on Tuya. And something went out. "Todoroki-san," Izuku said in a polite but distant voice. "I didn't expect." "Can we go in?" interrupted Enji, directly. Izuku hesitated. Just a second. Then he moved away, letting them pass. The apartment was small, tidy in an almost maniacal way. Few pieces of furniture, no photographs on the walls. Enji immediately noticed that absence. No family. No exposed past. Tuya stood near the entrance, stiff as a statue. Izuku closed the door and turned to face them, keeping a cautious distance. "If you're here for work," Izuku said calmly, "I can understand. I will not return to the villa. It's better this way." Those words struck Enji more than he had anticipated. "We're not here to fire you," he said. "That's what we're here for." And he took a step back, leaving Tuya in the center of the room. Tuya gasped. He did not expect such a direct gesture. He felt Izuku's gaze on him, attentive, cautious. Not accusatory. And that was precisely what made it unbearable. Tuya began, her voice harsh, controlled. "I have come to apologize." Izuku remained silent. "What I said." Tuya clenched his jaw. "It was wrong." The words came out like stones, one at a time. "I shouldn't have talked to you like that. Nor remind you what you are." Izuku looked down, his hands clasping into each other. Tuya took a deep breath. His chest hurt. "I didn't think." His voice trembled, imperceptibly. He stopped abruptly, as if he had lost control for an instant. "Tuya," said Enji. Tuya shook his head. "Let me finish." He looked up at Izuku again. His eyes were shiny, but his body remained rigid, proud. Alpha to the core, even as he was collapsing. "I didn't think you'd disappear," he said, his voice cracking despite his efforts to hold it still. I didn't want to make you cry." A tear ran down his cheek. Tuya stiffened even more, furious with himself. Izuku's eyes widened slightly. "I'm not good at saying that," Tuya continued, her breath breaking. "But, I'm sorry. Really." The silence that followed was fraught with tension. Then Izuku did something that no one expected. He took a step forward. And then another. And without saying a word, he hugged Tuya. It was not a hesitant gesture. It was instinctive. Izuku's arms encircled Tuya's rigid torso, squeezing it with disarming delicacy. Tuya stood still for a moment, shocked. Then his body gave way. His hands closed in the fabric of Izuku's sweater. His breath broke completely. Enji watched the scene in silence. His son, ferocious, proud, indomitable, crying in the arms of an Omega. And for an instant just one Enji saw something he had never allowed himself to think. Izuku calming down. Izuku who welcomes. Izuku who stays. As a mother would have done. The thought hit him like a punch in the stomach. He immediately chased him away. No, Izuku was not Rei. It was not a replacement. He was not there to fill emotional voids. She was a caregiver. Nothing else. And yet, Izuku spoke softly, his voice almost a whisper. "Thank you for coming." Tuya nodded against his shoulder, unable to speak. After a few seconds, Izuku slowly pulled away. Her eyes were shiny, but her smile was sweet. Not false. Tired but real. I just need a little time, he said, looking at NG. I don't know if I'll be back right away. NG nodded. I get it. It was a simple answer, but honest. When they left the apartment, Tuya didn't say a word. But the weight on his chest seemed, if not gone, at least shared. NG took one last look at the closed door. Izuku had not returned. But he wasn't gone entirely. And perhaps, for the first time in years, NG wondered if the strength was not only in commanding, but also in staying.